Africa is a land of great museums.
Kruger Museum was built in 1884.
Every museum has spellbinding stories to tell.
This is one of the first houses that had electric light.
Walk with me through this home filled with great history.
So this was a wagon house. This is a painting of Queen Wilhelmina.
Exercise your curiosity.
Paul Kruger laid the cornerstone of this church on his 75th birthday.
Explore.
It is in this room that they said farewell to one another before he left to go into exile to Europe.
Major support for Kruger House Museum by Ditsong Museums of South Africa, who is an agency of the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture.
Explore Africa's great museums.
You are very welcome to Kruger Museum in Pretoria. Kruger Museum was built in 1884 and it was built to house the president of then ZAR, Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, Paul Kruger. Now I just want to say to you that this is a very important heritage site here in Pretoria because it shows the culture of the Dutch-speaking president and his family, or part of his family, who lived in this house. I would like to orientate you before I speak specifically about the museum. We have Heroes Acre to the west, about 3 blocks to the west of this museum. And it is in Heroes Acre where Paul Kruger was buried in a big state funeral in 1904. He died overseas in Clarence in Switzerland, but that story I'm going to tell you in a moment. I also want to tell you that 3 blocks to the east of this museum, we have Church Square. There are very many historic buildings on Church Square, and most of them was built after 1886 when gold was discovered and the ZAR became what is today known as Gauteng. So if you visit us here, you will be visiting Gauteng. And then also in the middle of the square, there is a statue of Paul Kruger, and it was made by Anton van Wyk. Opposite this house where we are now, Kruger Museum, is the Dutch Reformed Church. Now this church was built in 1896. Paul Kruger laid the cornerstone of this church on his 75th birthday in 1896. The part that I like the most is the tower. The tower was actually made in the Netherlands, and then it was brought by ship to Durban, and then from Durban it was brought by ox wagon, and then it was put on the church. And if you look at the church and if you look at the tower, it is actually very high. I also have to say that it is a functional church. It is still functional today. And then you will see the 2 lions. Now the 2 lions are made of marble. It was a gift from Barney Benato to Paul Kruger on his 75th birthday. In 1919, this became a maternity hospital. And I find it so interesting. There are ladies who visit us, but only ladies. And then they say to me, my mother tells me that I was born in this house. How is that possible? And then I say, it became a maternity hospital from 1919 until 1925. And then in 1925, they started to restore it as a museum. And it opened its doors as a museum in 1934 for the first time.
The museum is divided into 4 sections. We have the main house in which the president stayed, 2 halls, and the 4th part is the railway coach there at the back.
So we are here in Gezina's reception room. It was one of the first of all, it's a very typically Victorian house. You can see by the furniture, you can see by the drapes. There are heavy curtains and then there are also lace curtains, and it's typically Victorian. The furniture in this house differs a lot from the furniture that you would find in the Cape at the time. Those were more stinkwood and yellow wood furniture. This furniture was ordered from a catalogue and it came by ship from overseas. This is one of the first houses that had electric light. I want you to look up at the ceiling and then see how high the ceiling is. The reason that they build it this way is to bring air and to bring light and to isolate the home. It was one of the first houses to have electrical light. The power station was in Schoeman Street and they brought the power from there to here. I also just want to say that if you look at the light fittings, it says licht and donker, and it was made by the company Siemens. Now Siemens today makes cell phones, so it's the same company and it's all copper switches. Remember, the house was built in 1884, so for its time it was very advanced to have electrical light, and also it had a phone. But it had a phone that was this size, which we will show you in a moment. We are now in Gezina's reception room. There is a photo of Gezina. That is what she looked like. She liked dressing in black. In this room, she would sit there next to the window and you can see 2 sewing boxes next to one another. She made the most beautiful dresses for her children and her great-grandchildren. And in this cabinet, you can actually see some of the dresses that she made. So she liked sitting here and sewing. She also liked sitting outside on the back veranda and peeling potatoes. She was not involved in her husband's political career. Paul Kruger and Gezina had 16 children. But by the time that they moved here to this house, Paul Kruger was already 57 years old. So most of the children were out of the house and they were married and they mostly had their own farms in those days. Gezina would receive many women in this room. They would sit around this table and they would drink tea. And the women that she received here would be the women accompanying their men. Many politics were discussed in the reception room of Paul Kruger, which we are going to just now.
We are now inside the president's reception room. This is where President Paul Kruger used to receive his guests. Guests like the mining magnates from England, the guys who discovered gold and diamond first here in Transvaal, like Benny Panato and Sammy Marks, and also his generals, like General Louis Botha, General Christian Tivet, and General Koos de la Rey. They used to visit the president here, busy discussing some serious issues inside this room.
Paul Kruger was a very religious man.
Here we have the trap orel, the organ, which came from the United States of America. The president used to have a short prayer here in the house before the people could come and visit him. Then his grandson will play it during that short prayer here.
He would call everybody at 6 o'clock in the morning, even the guards standing outside. He had Eva, and he had Mrs. Mostert, and he had Marapi working for him. They had to come, and then their youngest son, Chad, lived here with them for a while. And even if there were guests sleeping in the guest bedroom, everybody had to come to this room. They would read from the Bible, they would sing psalms, and they would use that organ to sing their psalms, and then they would pray. And then everybody could go back to their stations. We are still in Paul Kruger's reception room. So if you look at the coat of arms of the ZAR, it has 4-color flags on, the Transvaal 4-color flag, and then it says Eendracht maakt mag. Eendracht maakt mag means that if we stand together, we are strong.
President Paul Kruger received many gifts from different countries in Europe, including the US.
In this reception room, you can see the eagle behind me. This eagle was a gift from Irish American people during and after the Anglo-Boer War.
During the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902, a telegraph line was installed inside the President's Secretary's office. Then the Secretary would sleep on this bed in order to receive and send it about the war news. He slept on this bed for about 8 months. That's why you have a replica of the bed here by this corner.
Paul Kruger left Pretoria in 1900 and he never returned. He left his wife behind. Gesina stayed in the bedroom next to her reception room, and she passed away in 1901. There was a big state funeral for her, and she was also buried in Heroes Acre. Looking after Mrs. Gesina was her oldest daughter, Elsie Francina Elof. She was married to Frikkie Elof. Now, this is a very interesting story about this house. The stand on which the house was built belonged to Paul Kruger. So when he passed away in 1904, he left in his estate, he left this house to his son-in-law, Frikkie Elof. The Elofs, when after Mrs. Gesina died in 1901, they were given a choice. They could either go to the concentration camps, because at that stage the Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War was raging, or they could go with Paul Kruger overseas, and they chose the latter. So they basically looked after him for 4 years until his death in 1904 in Clarens in Switzerland. But the Elofs were then living in Den Haag in the Netherlands. They didn't return home immediately after Paul Kruger's death, and they decided to stay in Europe. And then this house became a boarding house. So a boarding house is where you rent out rooms. So rooms were rented out to different people. If we look at the furniture, I just quickly want to say that we have refurbished this house to its original state by looking at oral sources as well as written sources. We spoke to a lot of the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of Paul Kruger, and they would say to us, so here would be a fireplace and here would be these two statues. So we redecorated because when the British took over this house after Mrs. Kruger died, they used it as a quarters for them. And then most of the furniture an inventory was made and it was stored. So there are many original pieces in this house, but some of the pieces we have just based on the oral and the written research that we did. We just replaced the furniture to the best of our ability to the original, to what it was.
This is Paul Kruger's front office, which he used in his house. It's just next to his reception room. In this office, you would find one of the first telephones that was ever used in Pretoria.
This phone is a very historic phone. If you compare this phone to a cell phone today, there is no comparison. I just want to tell you that the number of this phone was number 1. And that is because Paul Kruger was the president of the ZAR. I don't think there were many people who had phones in their homes at that time. But if you look at this, you can see the batteries are at the bottom, and then it's got the sling. You have to turn the sling, and then you would get, and then you had a mouthpiece. You would hold the mouthpiece, and then you would hold the earpiece after you've turned the sling. And then somebody would, at some central point, they would then connect you to number 2 or number 3 or number 4 or number 5. I don't think there were many people important enough or rich enough to have phones in those times. And I also think that, remember, Paul Kruger was the state president, so he had, it was special. Everything that they put in this house was smart, and it was grand. It was fit for a president.
At the back here, we have a second office that was also used by Paul Kruger's private secretary, which was one of his grandsons.
So you are now in the Kruger Museum, and we are in the dining room of the Kruger Museum. You can see these doors are French doors, so it can open up completely. Because the food was prepared in the kitchen, which is, there's a back door. So if you open these doors, then the servants would bring the food. They would have sit-down meals, 3 meals a day, and they would sit around this table. Now, there were very often visitors, so it often was the Krugers plus visitors, or their own children who lived on farms elsewhere would visit them. So this table was normally filled with the Krugers.
In the middle, we have a telescopic table that can be enlarged by moving the pieces outwards to seat more people.
In the mornings, they would have porridge and milk. Paul Kruger loved dipping bread into milk and eating that. And then in the afternoon, they would have beef or meat. There was always meat in the afternoon, and then vegetables and rice or potatoes. Like I said, Mrs. Gazina loved sitting on the back stoop and peeling the potatoes. They had 3 servants in this house, and the first one was Mrs. Mostert. Mrs. Mostert was the housekeeper, and Mrs. Mostert didn't only have to oversee the meals, the 3 meals, the 3 sit-down meals that they had, but outside there was a baking oven. So as I said, Paul Kruger loved eating bread and dipping that in milk. Every day they would bake fresh bread in the baking oven. And then Mrs. Mostert also had to oversee everything that was going on outside, but especially inside the home. Not only the cooking of the food in the kitchen, but also clean linen on the beds and that type of thing. So here in the dining room, you will see this very interesting cup. This cup has a lip over it, over the top, and then there's a little space. So most men in those days either had a beard or a moustache or both. So if they drank tea from this cup, then the lip would prevent the moustache from getting tea on it. And then they could drink their tea like real gentlemen. So we are in the Kruger Museum. We are in the pantry of the Kruger Museum. We spoke about the electrical light earlier. And what is interesting about the time, 1884, when this house was built, they had a separate place to store the food. And this is the pantry. And then they had a separate place to prepare the food, and that is the kitchen, which is next door. They are adjoining. As you can see, all the bottles and the tins, when it was summer, they had very large plots. And in these plots, they had all the fruit trees, and then they would pick the fruit and they would tin them and they would put them in bottles so that in winter they had enough to live off. Remember, we in 1884, there were no shops. You couldn't go and buy a shop. There were vendors going around selling materials. There were even vendors bringing ice blocks. So I will show you in the kitchen a refrigerator and where they put the ice block in to keep the food cold. And this vendor that brought the ice would bring it in front of his bicycle. He had, it was put in a box in front of his bicycle, and he brought the ice on a weekly basis. So here we are in the kitchen of the Kruger Museum. So I would like to point out a few interesting features here. The first is here on my right is the baby bath. It's a porcelain baby bath that was actually put in here when it was a maternity hospital. So when the Krugers lived here, there was no running water inside the house at all. They had an outside well, and if they wanted to cook or if they wanted to wash themselves, then they would bring water from outside. They would warm it up on this Argos stove, and then they would bring it to every bedroom. So they didn't have a bathroom in this house as such. The second feature is the Argos stove. It's a beautiful stove. It works with wood, and then it makes the whole kitchen warm. So that is probably why they put the baby bath here, because it was warm when this was a maternity hospital. And then the fridge, as I've said, there was a person who came around with a block of ice. You can see this lid. You lift up this lid and you put the block of ice inside. And then if you open up here, cold air drops, goes down. So then they would put all the food that would perish down there, and as you know, hot air rises. So every week this peddler on his bicycle would come around and he would bring a fresh block of ice so that they could keep the food fresh.
This house only has 4 bedrooms. These bedrooms were mainly used by grandchildren that would come to visit, or children that would come and visit their father or grandfather. So these are one of the 2 guest bedrooms. And you would see inside here you have a wash table with a wash basin and jug.
This second bedroom here was used by the visitors or the guests.
This is the main bedroom of the house of Paul Kruger and his wife Bratina. And it is said that it is in this room that they said farewell to one another before he left the country to go into exile to Europe. You would also see that on that corner of the room you would have a commode. In those days there were no toilets actually inside the house but outside, so the commode was there for during night time. There is also a wash table with wash basin and jug.
So we are here in the Kruger Museum and we are in the ZAR Hall. Now, this hall was not here when the Krugers lived in the house. This hall was only built in 1952. As I've told you, it became a museum in 1934. What is interesting about this hall is that it was built on the foundation of the wagon house. So this was a wagon house, and here you can see an ox wagon. This is not the typical ox wagon with which they trekked over the mountains. This wagon is made of stinkwood, and it was made by a Mrs. van Wyk, specially for Paul Kruger as a present. Then over on that side there in the far corner, we have the state coach. This coach came from England. It was made by Torelli and Sons, and it was given to Paul Kruger as a present. But he didn't want to receive it as a present. He insisted that he wants to pay for it. So he did pay for it, and we know that he used this coach in his second inauguration. Now, what is also interesting about the coach is there are two in South Africa that I know of. The other one is at the Cape of Good Hope at the castle. And that was the state coach that was used by Simon van der Stel. So it's very similar to this one. In this hall, there are tokens of honor that were given to the Boer people during and after the Anglo-Boer War. It is important to know that on both sides, people from all over the world got involved in this war. There were people from Ireland, there were people from France, there were people from Russia, there were people from Switzerland fighting on the Boer side. And then the same on the other side, there were people also fighting on the British side. So in this hall you can see beautiful poems, you can see beautiful plates that are decorated in lovely colors. You can see newspaper journals from all over the world. You can see in the display cabinets, and you can see on the walls messages from people all over the world in sympathy with the Boers. So what you see around you are gifts and tokens and beautiful gifts, but nobody wanted to get involved in the war against Britain. Everybody was afraid of Britain. Bratina is also called the Fraternity Cup. This is a gift from Russia. Inside this base of the Bratina, you can see the stem of the pear wood, which is made of a pear wood tree, and you can see the beautiful carvings of the birds and the flowers. And then if you look up, you will see the fraternity cups. They are hanging down, and then inside there's a bowl. So the whole message, and if you look up, you will see the mountain, and then the silver Boer soldiers. And the whole idea, the whole message of this fraternity cup was to say, we are drinking with you from this bitter cup. And then inside the pear stem, it can open up, there's a key, and there's a book with 70,000 people, Russian people, signing their names, saying that we are in sympathy with you, the Boers. This was an initiative from Peter the Great, and everybody in Russia contributed. And if you take that 70,000 people signed their names just from Russia, you can imagine what was the sympathy around the world for the Boers in this fight against the mighty Britain. So we are here at Kruger Museum, and we are outside with the train which became the government on wheels. This train was used by Kruger. It was one of his many dreams to get a railway line from the ZAR to Delagoa Bay, so that he had a harbour, so that he could export goods. This train was built by NASM, the Nederlands-Zuid-Afrikaanse Spoorwegmaatskappy, and it was built in 1896, and they made two trains. They made this one and another one. This one was given to Paul Kruger as the president of the ZAR, and he used it to visit other places, to visit Natal, to visit the Orange Free State. But like I said, his big wish was to get this train, a railway line, up to Delagoa Bay. That was realized, and then when Paul Kruger left Pretoria in 1900, he left with this train. There were a few other carriages also hooked onto it. There were many soldiers going with the train. So when Lord Roberts marched up to Pretoria to take over Pretoria with his troops, then the Boers made a plan. You often hear in Afrikaans, we say, 'n boer maak 'n plan. So what the Boers did, they shifted their seat of government and they shifted it to this train. So it became a government on wheels. And with this train, they hooked many other wagons onto it, and then they went to Machadodorp. But it was very cold at Machadodorp, and Paul Kruger then decided that they will go to Waterval Onder. Now today at Waterval Onder, there's a house in which Paul Kruger stayed, and that house is actually also a museum. So that's another connection to Paul Kruger. So in this train, they had administration people on board, and they were still getting in telegraphs, how it's going in the war, and they were sending out telegraphs, do this tactic, do this, go there, that type of thing. So they were actually still fighting the war from this train that was then parked at Waterval Onder. It was also at Waterval Onder where all the troops were in their tents. They had these bell tents. It was in the shape of a bell, so they had these bell tents, and that's where they were living. And then Paul Kruger had to cross the border. He had to leave this train. He had to go to the governor of Mozambique, and he stayed with him. He stayed in his house until the Gelderland, the HMS Gelderland, the ship that Queen Wilhelmina sent, could fetch him and take him through the Swiss Channel to France. They landed in Marseille in France. It was about a 3-month journey on the ship. And then he took a train through France, through Belgium, and then he wanted to go to Germany, but the German Kaiser, Wilhelm, did not want to meet with him, and then he went to Den Haag. He lived in different houses there, and then before his death he went down to Switzerland, and that is where he took his last breath, in Clarence in Switzerland. We are in the Exile Hall. This hall did not exist, it wasn't here when the Krugers lived in the house from 1884 until 1900. This hall was built in 1962, and the reason that it was built was to show the many artifacts that we have, or the many objects that we have, that has to do with Paul Kruger leaving this country. He was 75 when he left. This is a painting of Queen Wilhelmina. She sent her ship. She met him when she was a small little girl, when her father was still King of the Netherlands. Paul Kruger, on one of his deputations, visited the family. And then Queen Wilhelmina was very impressed with Paul Kruger. And so when he was in trouble, as the British troops took over under Lord Roberts, they took Pretoria, and then they marched down the railway line to go and capture Paul Kruger. And then she knew that he had to get away into exile. So she helped him. She said, I will send this warship to fetch you. And this is a model of the Gelderland. You can see the chimneys on it. So they had to stop. They went through the Swiss Channel. They had to stop at many places to take in coal. Underneath these chimneys you can see rooms where they kept the coal in to keep the ship adrift. And there's also a photograph there of the ship actually sailing on the water. So something very interesting happened the day on which Paul Kruger left Pretoria. When some schoolboys in Philadelphia, they read about this war in South Africa, and they became motivated. They wanted to say to the Boers, we are in sympathy with you. So this scroll that you see over here and the signatures that you see were signed by 29,000 schoolboys from Philadelphia. And then it was put in this leather case, and after that it was put in this leather case. You can see it says Philadelphia, North America, to President Kruger, South Africa. They also gave a very nice American flag, which they brought with. And the president then saw Jimmy Smith, he received the gift, and that same afternoon he went overseas. So I think it must have been a very nice motivation for him. Again, voices from America supporting the Boer cause here in the ZAR. I represent Dit Song Museums of South Africa. We have three major museums. The one is the Natural History Museum in Paul Kruger Street, Pretoria. Then we have the National Museum of Military History, which is in Johannesburg. And then we have the Cultural History Museum, the National Museum of Cultural History, which is in Visagie Street. And that is where we kept most of our collections. We have about 9,000 items in our collections. We have wonderful collections. So we thought, based on this scroll that the 29,000 American school children signed and gave to Paul Kruger, that in 2018 we had an initiative. We reached out to schools, I'm going to name them, Pretoria High School for Girls, Curro Academy Mamelodi, Langenhoven Secondary School, and Loreto Convent School. And so we said to them, You know, in our South African Constitution, there is a part of the Constitution that talks about a constitution for children. We have one of the most advanced constitutions in the world, and our constitution is very much based on the Constitution of New Zealand. So all these schools were very positive, and then we said to them, okay, so what we want you to do, we are going to make our own DMSA, the Song Museums of South Africa Charter, and we'd like you to sign this charter if you agree with the following. So what we did, normally on the 10th of October, it is the birthday of Paul Kruger. So we always celebrate in some way. And then in 2018, on 10 October, we celebrated by saying to them, are you prepared to sign that you will follow in the footsteps of the great Nelson Mandela? He was the greatest humanitarian of all time. And then, will you respect others, be kind to others, love others, be selfless, forgive others, put others first, and then value life through healthy living by participating in sports. So we were very thrilled that these children signed. This is in the grade 9 syllabus, so we only asked grade 9s to participate, and they did, and it was wonderful for us. This is a very interesting picture which we have here at Kruger Museum. This is a picture that was taken on the funeral of Paul Kruger. He was actually buried in Den Haag, but then they requested that his body came back to South Africa, and his body came back with the Batavia 6, which is a ship that brought his body. He laid in state in Cape Town, and then he laid in state here in Pretoria for a few weeks in the Susanna Hall. Unfortunately, this Susanna Hall doesn't exist anymore. But you can see that there were 15,000 people at his funeral. They didn't go inside the church because you can see the damage to the church. And a year later, this was the burial of Paul Kruger. It was on 16 December 1904. And he was also buried in the Heroes Acre, which is 3 blocks from here, which I've told you about. So 15,000 people lined the streets, and you can see how they are dressed. It was during the Victorian period. Everybody's got a hat on, all the men and all the ladies. And so they buried Paul Kruger next to his wife, Gesina, in Heroes Acre. And now I want to talk about another hero, Nelson Mandela. If you look at this building, this is the Palace of Justice. So the Palace of Justice was built during Paul Kruger's time as president. And this is where Nelson Mandela gave his famous speech. He said, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." And luckily for South Africa, we had this wonderful man who was our first democratic president. And I just want to quote him on something else. Nelson Mandela also said, "Let your choices reflect your hopes and not your fears." So let's do that, South Africa. Let's reflect our hopes and not our fears. Make good choices. Thank you.